Hi, good evening. It's Thinking Slow. We've been off the YouTube channel for a little while now because YouTube has deleted the last bit of work we did with a sort of Kafkaesque kind of decision that we breached community guidelines. And that's a Kafkaesque decision because you don't really know who the judge is, you don't know who the jury is, you don't really know what the evidence is, and you basically have no right of appeal, or that there is an appeal to them which is answered in the negative, but with no rationale or reasoning. So that's why you haven't seen anything from us, and we it's very difficult to tell whether they're going to do that again because people that have been following this channel will know that we provide sources to all of the data, and everything is reasonably thoroughly researched. And we think we're presenting an objective picture, which basically that objective picture will undermine what many people will read in mainstream media and what people will hear from politicians. But YouTube has decided that's not acceptable and has deleted our last piece of work. So whether they do that again is impossible to say. But please look out for us elsewhere because most of our most interesting material is not on this channel. But we do put things on here basically and hope that they will stay up. So this one today is a lot of debate backwards and forwards I've seen this week about this big argument between hospitalizations with COVID. Are we talking about with COVID or for COVID? And I've seen so much wrong analysis basically that I thought let's put this together and hopefully share with you, what really is going on hospital admissions and hospital inpatients. So here we go, basically. I wanted to do a quick perspective of what's going on because, like a lot of these things, you get caught up in the day-to-day to and fro, and actually, in the grand scheme of things, the COVID hospitalization, both in the general beds and actually even in the intensive care units, is quite low as a percentage of capacity and quite low compared to where it's been in the recent past. So this isn't a big issue, and actually what we're talking about here is actually going from that relatively low level down to an even lower level by backing out the data where COVID is incidental. I think that's the main purpose of this presentation, is to deduct out those situations both for admissions and as inpatients, which is with COVID rather than for COVID. So we will identify what are the admissions, what are the inpatients with COVID. We'll split those out and we'll say those are not relevant when you're really trying to understand who's in hospital or admitted to hospital because of COVID or for COVID. So we'll do the perspective on that. We'll look at this in 2020 because a handful of brave souls have been shouting about this problem of mixing up with COVID and for COVID for hospital data for nearly 2 years now. And just a recap of what we did in 2020 on that. And we're going to then split this into admissions data, and we'll split with and for that. And we'll also then do the same thing for inpatient data with and for. And then just give you a teaser for what we'd like to do next on the intensive care data, YouTube allowing us hopefully to do that basically. So the perspective, as I mentioned, is that overall COVID inpatients are quite low as a percentage of total available beds. This is a nice chart that's for Wales and England, and I think Scotland is kind of similar picture, which is why I'm using this. But Wales does a nice job of putting this chart. This is a percentage of total capacity that's used by COVID patients. So the light blue line is critical care wards, where you're down about 10% now of total critical care beds are being utilised by COVID patients. And that's, of course, going in now. We're going into sort of peak flu season, will be mid-January. So that's a great number, basically. It's very few patients, and it's therefore a low percentage of the total capacity available. And these will be a mix of with COVID and for COVID, which we will split out. And in terms of the general beds, the percentage with COVID is even lower. This is now, this dark blue line is about 4% of capacity. So you have about 400 odd patients from total capacity of 10,000 beds. Hopefully that's right. Yeah, that's so this is a low single digit percentage, which again will include both patients there who are sort of with COVID and for COVID together. So again, the key point of this is that, as we split into those numbers of 4% and 10%, you're actually starting at quite a low level. And that's an important perspective to bear in mind, because, of course, the media doesn't really show that perspective. That's very visible also then on this chart. It's slightly confusing, the different categories of beds. So the one we were just looking at were the sort of general beds and the intensive care beds. And there's another category which NHS has, which is basically all beds. And this chart is basically from NHS England. It relates to NHS London. And this is all beds, basically. So it's a slightly hybrid category across intensive care, general, and all sorts of other things. But it's really the same picture, that down here at the bottom, you've got the percentage of total beds which are utilised by COVID, and that's about 5.5% at the moment. So you've got 94.5% of the beds, the total beds, are not utilised by COVID. So again, that puts a lot of perspective on COVID hospitalisation right now. It's quite low percentage-wise of the total capacity, and that's good news. And it's important to remember, as we go into splitting with COVID and for COVID, again, we're splitting a relatively small number within the overall grand scheme of things. So just going back quickly to 2020, we knew and others knew, Alison Pearson at Telegraph has been on about this quite a lot, and Hugh Osmond as well, that a lot of people are getting COVID once they're already admitted. And, this was a deep dive in 2020, and I'll provide a link at the end into what was happening at the Imperial Hospital Trust, where basically this is the peak of the first wave. Early on, you have basically all of the COVID inpatients, and basically this red section is really, I would say, for COVID. And when they or the researchers unraveled this, they could see this number going down and down as the share of total COVID inpatients, and the share where COVID was just incidental, which is previous diagnosis not related to current admission, yellow goes up and up. And so we know this happens basically, and we did quite a lot of work on this in 2020. And in a way, we're just refreshing this for 2021, and we'll show basically the same charts, but relative to right now. But we've been talking about this for a long time now, basically. So starting off now, this is the main part of the analysis, where we're looking at admissions. NHS, to be fair, actually breaks this down quite reasonably, and this for me is confusing, why all the media talking heads and the politicians are jumping up and down saying we need more data, we need more visibility. If they actually spent any effort and used some intelligence, they could actually work out roughly what is going on from the data that's already available. And this data is for admissions, and there's quite a lot of different categories of admission. but I'm just focusing in on two here, which is basically the blue section are the patients who are admitted to hospital already with a positive COVID test. The yellow section are the patients who are diagnosed with COVID as inpatients. Now, my basic position on this is when you're doing more than 1 million tests a day, I find it very difficult to believe that someone who was sick with COVID was not tested before they got into hospital, basically. So my basic assumption on here is that the blue section represents patients who were admitted for COVID. So they came in and they had already had a positive COVID test. And that's much more likely than those who were diagnosed with COVID as inpatients being there for COVID. So if you add the top of the yellow or the orange area is basically with COVID, and I'm saying the blue section on its own is for COVID. And based on this data, the number fluctuates, of course, but around about 55% of total admissions are diagnosed as inpatients. So that leaves 45% being admitted with a positive COVID test at the time of admission. So I'm saying roughly, certainly on the admissions data, you can take slightly less than half, and that will give you what I would consider to be patients admitted for COVID rather than with COVID. So I hope that makes sense. And in many ways, you'd expect that to feed through into the inpatient position, but there's some nuances there. It doesn't exactly work out for inpatients, but I think you can see from this breakdown the difference who's been admitted with a positive COVID test and then who's receiving in the orange section a positive COVID test post-admission. And I'm saying most of this area will be COVID incidental. And this is a direct extract from NHS England. They make it very clear. I don't want to give all credit to the NHS statistical working area that you can see all of this. All the definitions are there. This is the blue section. You're admitted with a positive test. And then this is the orange section that's for inpatients, and they define this all quite carefully and they put the data in there, so it's all there for anyone that really wants to look for it. Now the next bit that we want to look at is the breakdown of inpatients, basically. And here also, to be fair to NHS, they've recognised this as a valid question. Who of the inpatients are really there for COVID, and they basically have now produced a supplementary analysis, and I think there's a link you can see at the bottom of the chart here, basically, primary diagnosis supplement. This is for NHS London, and here they have basically identified in blue these are the COVID inpatients who are there primarily for COVID, and then the orange line is the total. Now the difference between those is about, roughly speaking, 25%, and it's slightly higher for England as a whole. It's closer to 30%. So again, going back to that first chart for Wales, when we're talking about total beds or general and acute beds, we're talking about 4-5% of those beds being COVID related with COVID. So if you're taking 25% away from those to get to for COVID, you're going from 5% roughly to 4%, or 4% down to 3%. So again, the perspective of this is quite a small single-digit percentage being reduced by 25% to get to actual hospital inpatients for COVID. Now, my personal feeling, and I don't know because I'm not a medical specialist by any means, but I can read statistics and I can read definitions. My personal gut feeling here is that the admissions figure feels a little bit more believable that actually, maybe 45% of those admissions with a COVID certificate are really for COVID. So I would expect, this inpatient gap to be bigger, basically. I would expect to see for COVID being, roughly, again, about half of the total inpatients with COVID. And that's not the case here. The way they have this is from the total, 75% is for COVID, and then you got this 25% difference to get to with COVID. Now, again, and where we are today, it's not that relevant with 5% of total beds being COVID related. But, if that number was higher, this would become a bigger question then. But mercifully, at the moment, these numbers are relatively not high, and then taking 25% off gets them even lower. And of course, then taking 50% off would get them lower still. But that's, as I said, from these low levels, that's not really a critical consideration at this stage. But, again, to be fair to NHS, they fully disclosed this. So all the media people and politicians screaming for more data, there is a fair bit of data. Well, there's a lot of data actually in that statistical work area where you can get all this from. So that was really it. Just wrapping up on the admissions side. I would say if you look at the total admissions on the government's dashboard, 45% of those I would say would be for COVID, because they are being admitted with a COVID certificate. And then if you look at COVID hospital inpatients in the general and acute area, then you can take 25% away from that number, and the NHS will acknowledge that sort of remaining 75% is for COVID. Now, there's still a bit of a debate to be had. Could that 75% be a bit lower? Maybe yes, maybe no. But already the data's there that acknowledges that the inpatients are maybe 75% of the total number is for COVID. So that was really it. There's links to the statistics, and I'll put some of the data up on our website, thinkingslow1.com. And I'm just going to finish here with a little teaser for what we wanted to do on critical care units. And this was deleted last time, so of course I'm slightly nervous doing it again. The censors may take this thing out, but this is a direct copy-paste from a report on English admissions into critical care by month. You can't see the month here, unfortunately, but this is November, October, September, and so forth. But from these bars, you can see basically that the majority of critical care admissions in England have been amongst the vaccinated, and therefore the unvaccinated, this section, is the minority. And for November 2021, the figure was 48%. And, you basically read all these tweets and read all these completely misleading media talking heads talking about 90% of cases in ICU are unvaccinated. Very much untrue. What they have done is identify a tiny unit that has less than 2% of the total admissions go to that unit. So I think in November, the admissions were about 18 admissions into that unit from nearly 2,500 total critical care admissions. So it's completely unrepresentative. They cherry pick a completely unrepresentative number, which totally goes against the conclusion of what's going on in critical care overall, and then basically start writing articles and tweeting out that completely unrepresentative number. For me, it's totally dishonest. I find it extremely irritating. And when I try and point that out, the pointing that out will then be censored. But we want to do a separate episode on this because it really points to a lot of questions about integrity, where the statistics regulator is looking. I saw his response on this very, very weak. Um, this is really bad. I mean, this shouldn't be happening, and this is a symbol of the post-truth world where the politicians and media are basically nudging people into doing what they want them to do by essentially misrepresenting or grossly misrepresenting statistics. So that's hopefully another episode for later in the week, to see if YouTube lets us do that or not. That'll be interesting. And then just wrapping up. So as I said, I'll put the details on the website, so you'll be able to see the split of with COVID and for COVID for admissions and inpatients. So that'll go up in a couple of days or so. But here's the link to pretty well all of the material from this short video. If you have any questions or comments, put them up on the message board here. We'll try and get back to them all. And as I said, at the end of every video that hopefully is becoming clearer and clearer, don't stay safe, stay free, because without freedom you don't have safety. And totalitarian government is way more dangerous than this virus that we're facing at the moment. So stay free, and thank you very much. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe, please like, please share. Like I said, we need all the help we can get. We don't know how long this is going to be up there. Most of our material is censored, so any kind of circulation is very, very welcome. Thank you very much. Goodbye.